Here we are with essay grading crash course slides. A crash course designed to teach you everything you need to know to grade the essay portion of diagnostic exam number 1, because we won't actually cover the essay lesson for a number of weeks. So the first thing you should know if you're going to grade these essays is what students were writing about. Unfortunately, the SAT essay uses a generic prompt that appears on every single exam. Now what changes is the particular passage you're being asked to analyze. So on diagnostic exam number 1, it's this passage by Jimmy Carter about Arctic refuges and caribou. But on other exams, the passage will be something else, some other text. But the prompt, what the SAT writers are asking you to do, will not change. It'll always be this generic prompt, and it's in 2 parts. This is the first part, and then they give the passage, and then there's this longer part that appears after the passage. So what's key about the fact that it doesn't change is once you understand what the SAT writers are asking you to do or asking your students to do, you don't have to relearn it for every essay. You just know what the prompt is, and then you know what you're expecting for any particular passage. So I'm not going to go through the details of this prompt line by line right now. When we teach the essay lessons later, you will go through it line by line with your students, and I'll make a video that goes through it in more depth at that point. For now, I encourage you to read through it on your own so you're familiar with it, but we'll just go over my own gloss of what students are being asked to do. So what they're being asked to write about is first, what is the author's claim? That's the first question. They need to include this in their essay. They need to identify the author's claim. They also need to answer this question. How does the author build an argument to persuade his or her audience? This is the key question the SAT prompt is asking in its many, many lines, and it's easy to get lost in them. But this is a one-sentence summary of what they're asking. They're asking students to write an essay about how an author persuades the audience. Not what the argument is. Yeah, students have to identify the claim, but they're not writing an essay just summarizing the claim. They need to write an essay about how the author constructs the argument to persuade the audience. And if they don't, they won't get a very high score. So some other sub-questions to ask here. Is the author appealing to logic or emotions or morals of the audience? And how do style choices affect the effectiveness of the author's argument? And as I just said, students should not be talking about whether they agree with the argument. We don't care about the content of the argument. They shouldn't be summarizing it. We don't care whether they agree with it. They should be talking about how it is constructed. Okay, so that's what students are being asked to write an essay about at a high level. Next, scoring. So how are you going to score this thing? This is a nice graphic. I didn't make it. Rebecca, our previous verbal coordinator, either made this or found it online, I guess. But I stole it from her. But I think it's a really nice breakdown of how to grade the essay. So the essay scored out of 24 possible points, but that's broken down into 3 8-point categories: reading, writing, and analysis. And the way that the essay is actually scored is you'll have 2 readers reading your essay, so reader 1, reader 2, and then they will assign a score for each of these 3 categories out of 8. They will assign a score for each of these categories out of 4. And then the scores will be added together, and you'll get a score for each category out of 8. So that's how the SAT essay is actually graded. When we grade diagnostic exams, we're not going to have 2 readers score it. So instead, you're going to ignore this orange step here, and you're just going to give the essay a score from 2 to 8 in each of these categories. So you read the essay, you give it a 2 to 8 in reading, a 2 to 8 in writing, a 2 to 8 in analysis. You add them up, and that's the score. Okay, that sounds simple enough, but we should also look at, of course, the details of what you're grading in each section. So the essence of the reading portion of the rubric is that you're grading how well students comprehended the passage. Did they comprehend it, and then did they support what their claims about the passage with textual evidence? Here it is in a little more details. This is the actual wording of the rubric that readers use to grade the essay, and so you should also abide by these guidelines. If students want to score a 4, they need to first demonstrate a thorough understanding of the text. Okay. They also need to show an understanding of the central ideas and how, the details and how they interrelate. What this means is that students can't just write about the author's claim at a high level. If the argument has 3 main subparts, they need to mention all of the subparts in their argument. In their essay. If the argument is structured as an example and then a counterexample and a refutation, the students need to mention all 3 of those parts. If it's structured as I don't know what another structure would be, but if the author's argument is structured in a way that it has certain main subparts, the student's essay needs to mention all of those. It can't just focus in on one irrelevant detail, and it can't just talk about the argument at a high level without noting any details. So that's the second part of the reading rubric. The third part is that the student doesn't make errors. Okay, that's probably intuitive. And the fourth is that the student uses textual evidence to support their claims about what the author is arguing. So this is how a student gets a 4, and if they don't do one of these things, or they do all of them somewhat well, they get a 3, and then a 2, and then a 1. And you can look at the Blue Book or online for detailed descriptions of 3, 2, and 1, but it's basically deviating from this ideal pattern. And I put 1 here, but I'm not going to go through it in this video. Then we have the writing category. So the essence of this is, does the student using organized, precise, and sophisticated language? Are they using correct grammar and sentence structure and vocab? Are they structuring it well? And do they have a thesis statement? But let's look at the details again of a 4. So the first point here is if a student wants a 4, they need to demonstrate a highly effective use and command of language. Basically, they're not using words improperly, and they are using advanced vocabulary. Second, it needs a precise central claim. The thesis statement is so important to the essay that it has its own bullet point on the writing rubric. Students' essays need a thesis statement. If there's no thesis statement in the introduction, don't give it a 4. At maximum, give it a 3. Next, it needs to be structured well. So there needs to be an intro, body, and conclusion, and hopefully some progression of ideas or flow between paragraphs. There needs to be a variety in sentence structures. This bullet point is really saying 3 separate points, but for some reason they group it together. There needs to be a wide variety in sentence structure. There needs to be a consistent use of precise word choice, again, not using language improperly, and it needs to maintain a formal style and objective academic tone. And finally, it should be relatively free of grammatical errors. A few is fine, it's an in-class essay, but if the grammatical errors are such that they impair your ability to understand what the student is saying, they should be docked points for them. And here's a 1, we won't go through it. Then analysis. This is probably the most, I don't want to say the most important category because it's worth as much as the other 2, but it's the real crux of the essay, and it's the category in which students usually score the lowest. The essence here is what I said before. The SAT writers want to see if students are analyzing the author's use of stylistic and persuasive techniques in constructing their argument. Not just summarizing the argument, that's the reading portion of the rubric, but actually analyzing how it is constructed. And often students don't do that. The other thing is that students have to support their claims with textual textual evidence. And we'll look at the details. So the first point here is the student needs to offer an insightful analysis and demonstrate they understood the task. Well, that's what I just said. They understand the task of analyzing how the author constructs the argument. Then the second point is that the student offers a thorough, well-considered evaluation of the author's use of evidence and blah, blah, blah. This is basically saying the same thing as the point up here. Then it contains relevant, sufficient, and strategically chosen support for the claims and points made. This means that students need to include not just any example of a literary or rhetorical device, but they need to include the most relevant examples. So just like with reading, they shouldn't be focusing on small, irrelevant details that doesn't show that they comprehended the author's overall argument. Here, they shouldn't be focusing on irrelevant things that the author does. They need to focus on the main literary or stylistic techniques that the author uses to persuade an audience. There's often many of these. Students don't need to mention all of them, but they should mention the main ones rather than just BSing something. And finally, I guess I mixed up these two. What I just said is what this last one is saying, and what this third one is saying is that there's textual evidence. Either way, you need what I just said, and then students also need to support it with evidence from the text. And here's a 1. You can look at that if you want. So, a summary of what your job is. You're going to give the score a reading, You're going to give the essay a reading score out of 8. Then you're going to give it an analysis score out of 8. Then you're going to give it a writing score out of 8. You're going to add them together. You're going to get a total score out of 24. You're going to do this for every essay. And ideally, you should also write some feedback to the students. You're going to be passing these essays back in class, and it's good for students to know what they messed up on. I always write at the end, when I write, reading, analysis, and writing, I write a little explanation of why they got the score that they did. I think that's really helpful for students. And a couple of notes. The lowest possible score in any category is a 2 out of 8. You shouldn't be giving any 1s or 0s. The reason is, well, I don't know the reason. That's just what the SAT does. It's like the lowest score you can get on the SAT is 400 out of 1600. Why does that make sense? Who knows? Then that means the lowest possible score you can get on the essay in total is 6 out of 24. If any student has lower than a 6, you scored them improperly in some way. And one final note about grading that I think is very important is that grading is equal parts science and art. I probably should say grading essays is equal parts science and art. There is a science to it. You need to be familiar with the rubric, and you can pattern match the rubric with students' responses, but there's also an art to it. As you grade more essays, you'll just develop a sort of intuition and familiarity with what a 4 is and what a 3 is and what a 24 essay is, and etc. So don't be afraid or don't feel like you have to be perfect at first. Just give, as long as your grades are within a ballpark of correctness, and they definitely will be, then you're doing fine. And over time, as you grade more of these essays, you'll see more variety in student responses, and you'll start to hone in on what exactly a really good versus okay versus not very good analysis looks like, as well as reading and writing. Okay, that's it. Have fun grading essays. I'll see you later.